Well, cheers. Hello, everybody. This is Gord Carkner from my YouTube channel, bringing you another seminar. I work with graduate students and faculty at the University of British Columbia under the Graduate and Faculty Christian Forum and the Graduate Christian Union. We love to have these kind of discussions about important cultural issues and social issues. And so today we're talking about the existential identity crisis of millennials. For my PhD work, I actually began to look at the late modern self, the quest for freedom, the search for identity, and so it fits well with this kind of thing. And there's been a lot in the news. You've probably seen the video by Simon Sinek on millennials and what the challenges are for them in the workplace. There are many other people discussing millennials and some of their struggles, and we want to talk about this today. So the subtitle is Kicking at the Darkness, a Multi-Dimensional Strategy. And very much look forward to how this is going to go. And I'm glad you're able to join us on YouTube, and very much hope you can use this material for discussions with your colleagues and friends. It is interesting that the Simon Sinek video, which you can see here, you could click on that link and go to that video. Simon sort of captured some of the key issues for millennials, and really with a good sense of humor, etc. So I recommend you look at that. It had 12 million views, so it must have hit a chord of some sort. His breakdown of the issues for millennials is that there's a struggle with their parenting, that there's a problem with technology, and a sense of impatience, and a problem with delayed gratification, and particularly a struggle in adjusting to the work world, from the university world or family world to the work world. And so that's kind of interesting. Here are some of the stereotypes. I don't go for that, but sometimes they fit. Millennial stereotypes: entitled, narcissistic, self-interested, unfocused, and lazy. I want to talk about some of the struggles that they're facing, and also work towards some solutions to kick at the darkness a little bit and hope that it bleeds daylight, as Bruce Coburn's song talks about. So here are 5 clouds or 5 barriers to healthy identity growth in millennials. And it's probably the same kind of clouds that hangs over every generation. First of all, ideological scientism. I wrote an article called Late Modernity, the Challenge of Scientism and the Search for Meaning. A key thinker here is David Bentley Hart. This is a belief that we are a merely material world, and that all that really matters, all the truth that really matters, is scientific truth. Exclusive humanism, closing the door on the immanent frame. This is from Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, chapter 15. He's one of my favorite philosophers, Canadian philosopher at McGill University. And I highly recommend you read that book, A Secular Age. It talks about the way we've transitioned in the last 500 years in Western thought, and how we see ourselves, the cultural ethos. The third is some of the problems in culture today, in politics: white supremacy, populism, fear, resentment, the alt-right. This promotes societal divisiveness, tribalism, even anti-humanism. You know, it's that us versus them mentality. Key thinker here is Timothy Snyder at Yale University. I recommend his books, his insights. Fourthly is the reductionistic definitions of the human person. For example, the greedy animal, Homo economicus. Everyone acts in a purely selfish manner and self-centered manner. Nick Hanover's TED Talk is very good on this point, captures it in 18 minutes, the dirty secret of capitalism. And then pornography, which devours the moral soul and is warping people's identity through a base kind of lust. Here's a quote from The Tale of Two Cities. Perhaps you noticed this or remember this from high school studies. I think one of the key issues we need to address in this talk is suffering and tragedy. It may be that that's at the heart of everything we're talking about, the millennial angst. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. This really speaks not only to the early part of the French Revolution, but also the current age of ambivalence. It is true that millennials generally, in general, do not want to suffer. Yet, as we know, suffering is the #1 apologetic issue. It's possibly, in many ways, the way into one's own soul. We see this in the video with Ravi Zacharias in dialogue with Ben Shapiro. I recommend that to you. These are the 4 basic culture spheres: religion, as the aesthetic, scientific, and the ethical. And in many ways, in recent years, these have been split off from each other, and there's an alienation between them. At one time, during the modern era, the Enlightenment, scientific culture sphere was dominant. In the Middle Ages, I guess you would say the religious culture sphere dominated. More recently, in the postmodern or late modern era, the aesthetic is trying to assert its dominance. And that leaves the ethical sometimes out on a limb. But I'm suggesting that what Calvin Schrage in his book, The Self After Postmodernity, said is that in one sense, we need to find a way of bringing these culture spheres back together, reconnecting them. And I've noticed in a recent author and speaker, Jordan Peterson, not to give him too much profile in this video, but that he sees suffering and tragedy, the recognition of the importance of suffering and tragedy in the human soul as a key link to many, many deeper things. So it may be a door that we can open into the deeper life and getting beyond superficiality. So let's see if we can make sense of that. Suffering, I think, in some ways can help us focus. It's the existential link between the religious, the ethical, the scientific, and the aesthetic. It marshals all our resources, pulls us together as an integral self, and puts us in touch with reality. A key insight here is that pain can be a source of illumination, a wake-up call, as C.S. Lewis might say in The Problem of Pain, an invitation to deeper meaning, to produce a more resilient self in the long run. Therefore, we must be born not to be happy, but to suffer well. That is, towards the good, towards personal transformation and even personal redemption, on a journey of moral growth. Such was the language and the thrust of a talk given by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Russian writer and dissident, at a Harvard graduating class, a commencement class in 1978. And in fact, all the great spiritual giants, if you really look into their lives, they speak of suffering, tears, and anguish. At some point, we all have to deal with the problem of suffering and the problem of evil as well. Note that when we had the death of Kobe Bryant, it really bonded us all together in mourning. So that's one aspect of suffering. I was recently reading a book by David Brooks called The Second Mountain, and he had a beautiful little section on insights on suffering and how it can help the moral soul, the individual search for identity. So I just summarized a few of his thoughts here. Suffering is a foghorn that blasts us out of our complacency. It's connected to a larger narrative of change and redemption. It allows us to suffer our way to wisdom. Suffering teaches us gratitude, puts us in solidarity and sympathy with others who suffer, tenderizes our heart, and makes us more human. We can all choose how we respond to suffering. Some respond with generosity and a call to service. Suffering shatters the illusion of self-sufficiency so that we can see the importance of the interdependent life, the communal life. Pain helps us see the true size of our egotistical desires and the falseness of many of our ambitions. When we are brought low, humility can be achieved. So these are just some of the insights on how suffering can actually improve our sense of self. And if we deal with it properly, if we respond to it properly, and it can actually pull us together in certain ways. Who would have thought that the answer to the question, how do I get myself together? How do I pull myself together if I feel fragmented and confused in today's society, would be that I need to suffer more, but I need to suffer well. Anyway, we're moving along to the next section of this presentation. And we really want to talk about a multidimensional strategy. This is part one, a multidimensional strategy to dealing with the crisis of millennial identity, millennial angst, you could say. It involves imagination, discernment, commitment, humor, hospitality, and tragic optimism. It's my conviction, having worked with university students my whole life, my whole career, that we cannot afford to give up on the largest and most diverse generation in the history of Canada. It is crucial that we find a way forward. We must play the infinite game. We must keep working at this until we find some solutions. In the Bible, Romans chapter 8, verses 26 and 27 speaks to this idea of perseverance, to kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. So let's now map out some of the contours of our current crisis with millennials. First of all, I wanted to address the issue of a corrupt view of freedom in our society, and especially among millennials. There's a radical mythology of autonomous individual choice, which is the ultimate absolute for people. It's a self-constituted freedom as an ideal of self-definition, self-interpretation, and self-justification. This fits well with my PhD work on Michel Foucault and the late modern self, the search for identity in the late modern self. Radical freedom is hardwired into the modernity and late modernity, and thus millennials feel it in their bones. But it fails us, leaving us with a loneliness crisis. The creed of this corrupt view of freedom is, I will be who I choose to be. Negative freedom against authority, tradition, the establishment, past ethics, and social norms. There's a kind of impatience and entitlement in this. This idea of freedom really goes back to the 1960s, the rebellious 60s, and the countercultural revolution. So it's not a new thing, but it's much more intensified in our day. So it is unfortunately a freedom that is disconnected from the moral good. And I want to say that we're working on the reconnection of ethics to the four culture spheres. And we realize we can't live with science alone. We can't live with religion alone. We can't live with aesthetics alone. The hope here is of reconnecting freedom to virtue and responsibility, which comes from some authors like Jim Wallace in The Uncommon Good, Charles Taylor in The Sources of the Self, David Brooks in The Road to Character, and his second book, which I'm really appreciating at this point, The Second Mountain. Emmanuel Levinas is a French philosopher who really talked about seeing in the face of the other your responsibility. So taking responsibility for the other is a central plank in his whole philosophy. Here's another issue for millennials, the risky behavior to counter their boredom. This is a man up on a rooftop, whether they're taking pictures from these dangerous heights or just the thrill of life, being on the edge of life and death. There are other things like extreme sports, internet dating, and that sort of thing. So it's something to really be concerned about. The addiction to technology is the next concern on our mapping of the millennial generation. Smartphones are really a central part of our life. They've grown up with them. They're checked on the average of 150 times a day. And they are, together with social media, they're contributing to a kind of attention deficit syndrome. This causes the intermittent reinforcement of the dopamine pathway. Neuroscientists could tell you all about that. It's very similar to a form of drug addiction. The motivational speaker, Simon Sinek, says that there is a poor coping mechanism. This is really a poor coping mechanism for stress and boredom. So again, boredom, existential boredom or ennui is part of what they struggle with. And so watching the latest YouTube video or seeing the latest post or somebody saying they like your Instagram posting or that sort of thing is part of their bloodstream, so to speak. In other aspects of social media, there's a sense in which social media, it's being recognized now that social media has been kind of weaponized. Tech icons use behavioral psychology research to get kids addicted. They practice behavioral modification and spying. The goal, apparently, among people from the inside is that they want to get 100% of our attention. One of the people that are speaking out on this, former Silicon Valley titan, is Jaron Lanier. He's written a book on it now, and he's sort of a Silicon Valley philosopher. The other place where you could find insight on this is the movie on Netflix called Social Dilemma. I don't think I've seen anything better on this particular topic than on that particular video that you hear from Jaron Lanier and several other people who are concerned about this issue. And then this is increasing levels of loneliness, anxiety, and depression that go hand in hand with the depersonalization of a high-tech age. The correlation is now established by studies. Only on the internet can you be desperately lonely and extremely popular at the same time. We have to really be concerned about the monetization, a monetized depression of our children. This loneliness factor is quite a big issue, and especially among guys. I think they are several times more likely to be suffering from the angst of loneliness than women. More on addiction. There's typical binging on Netflix or YouTube videos, sometimes when the deadlines for your final exams and your papers are pressing. It's a good way of escaping. Guys are addicted to video games, particularly. They love being a heroic, virtual, high-risk warrior, where they can, after they've been shot dead, they can start again and blow more things up. Regent College professor Craig Gay recently wrote a book called Modern Technology and the Human Future, and he noted in a recent talk at UBC, one of our GFCF talks, that the machine worldview increasingly dominates our culture. And that's really true. We are kind of upgrading our machines while we're downgrading our humans, appealing to the lower lizard brain. So that's a very strong concern. I highly recommend that book, Modern Technology and the Human Future. Technology, the other book on technology that I've read recently is by Jeff Booth called The Price of Tomorrow. And I think he's telling us a lot about where we're going with AI technology in particular, and the impact it will have on our culture. So Jerome Lanier says, close down your social media for 6 months and find out who you really are. He sees it as a kind of crack, a kind of drug. And so it's something to pay attention to. Here's another category, another piece of the puzzle or the map of late modern millennial angst. The lack of clear moral grounding and training. Moral subjectivism and ethical relativism are in tension with political correctness. You know, the idea of diversity training. Subjectivism calculates as moral autism. It makes us weak, says Christian Smith at Notre Dame and Matthew Crawford in The World Beyond Your Head. So ethical relativism may sound like a cool, tolerant way of posturing yourself in the world, but actually it's having a very destructive impact, and it makes us weaker inside, unable to choose morally, and really kind of conflicted and lost. Under this category, the second point I want to make is that we're missing a social common good and vision, social glue to hold us together as a just society. And we can see that in the divisiveness in the recent American election. Can really see the moral, the moral vacuum in our public spaces. Next, the poor understanding of moral frameworks and their implications for identity. I've done a lot of work on this in Charles Taylor, and I found this helpful on the understanding of the late modern self and how the healing process could occur. In Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self, and I guess A Secular Age and The Language Animal, those three great tomes. But also Dallas Willard has addressed this issue in The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. So moral frameworks, recovery of moral frameworks, recovery of the moral soul really is at the heart of our common concern today. Because without that, we won't have a full healing for millennials. They'll feel disconnected and lost. There's the issue of absent fathers. Many people are growing up in single parent homes, and often it's the mother who's raising the children, not the father. So there's a gap in mentoring, especially leading to extended adolescence in male. Meg Jay, in her TED Talk, Why 30 is the New 20, is very helpful on this question. I think I highly recommend her. She's a specialist in adolescent identity. I have another YouTube talk on Charles Taylor and the Modern Quest for Identity, and this speaks to the issue of the crisis of affirmation. The problem of self-loathing and moral lobotomy is connected to the problem of evil. So I recommend you turn to that YouTube video as well. So overall, this is the lack of clear moral grounding and training. I wanted to say that when a university student is going through the halls of academia, often they are being taught two lessons. On one hand, they're taught tolerance, relativism, subjectivism. On the other hand, they're taught the absolutes of political correctness. And so I think that creates a moral ambivalence inside them, and they're not sure how to put those two together. It creates a kind of internal dissonance or conflict. Another category, which I think is really critical today, especially as millennials are trying to adjust to the workplace, is performance anxiety. I think it's not just millennials, but it's across the board. The measure of anxiety, guilt-ridden You know, it's just that our employers just, enough is never enough. Quantitative production is everything. And people feel a deficit of being seen as worthwhile in and of themselves. Again, Matthew Crawford has done a brilliant job of this in his book, The World Beyond Your Head, 183 and following. I think Matthew has an insight that we can be so weak inside without the moral triangulation, without a sense of moral community and a sense of a strong moral foundation of self. We're very vulnerable to becoming a slave of the corporation and the corporate agenda, being totally molded into the image of the corporate guy or woman. The temptation of performance-enhancing drugs comes in here, drugs like Prozac and Adderall. There's an epidemic usage among high-performance university students and faculty. Everybody wants to perform to their best. And so this is the high achievers side of things. And this can result in depression, and the bipolar problem is just horrific for people. It's a significant issue in academia and has led to suicides. I must give a shout out, thanks to President Ono, who's the current president at UBC, and the way he has called out depression as an issue on campus. He's struggled with it himself, and it's been extremely helpful for the UBC community to be able to talk about that in the dorms, with counselors, in classrooms, etc. So thanks, Dr. Ono, for that. For postgrad students, it's all about standing out from the crowd for grants, postdocs, and future jobs, especially tenure track academic teaching jobs. The big worry is if you are a PhD student and you want to teach in the academic world, the big worry today is sessional purgatory, that you'll be teaching a course or two per year, per semester, and you try to piece together a life and a career based on that, and always waiting for that full-time position. The competition is extremely intense these days, and it's very much a challenge for postgrad students. Eugene Peterson on this point of performance anxiety, he really speaks to the question of identity in Christ in his book, Practice Resurrection. In our identity-confused society, too many of us have settled for pastiche identity composed of social security number, medical records, academic degrees, job history, and whatever fragments of genealogy we can salvage. I think that's true, and that's a kind of reductionism. If we don't have more than that, we will have a kind of weak identity. And so what we are working towards in this presentation is actually moving towards holism of identity. And I once sat down and just charted out what I thought were the different categories of identity, different questions, different issues people consider when they're talking about identity. And I found 28 categories. I was actually quite surprised at that. And, you know, we often think of identity as either our sexual orientation or our ethnic background or just a narrow category. And I think that it's a much broader thing, and we should pay attention to those broader, richer categories towards this idea of a thick self, not a thin self. So as a result of the performance, the performance factor, the performance question in our identity, many people are ending up in a permanent state of burnout. What's happening there is that in the gig economy, we are working day and night. In the internet age, it means feeling that we need to work all the time. We need to read more articles. There are more articles coming out about burnout as a serious aspect of millennial angst. And it is hard to keep it all together, to keep family, to raise a kid. Because, you know, the idea is, again, that you must be an optimized worker product. I need to be a clean, mean production machine, a finely honed tool, and also good at everything else in life, parenting, being a good friend, etc. So a lot of pressure on people today in this situation. A lot of tiredness, a lot of exhaustion. One disenchanted millennial wrote starkly, "Burnout is our permanent resident." I found that a kind of shocking statement. A testimonial on this point, a BC surgeon friend of mine shocked me when he said 1/3 of doctors are suffering from depression, 1/4 are experiencing burnout. It's an illustration of the Gray's Anatomy phenomenon. So life can be challenging, and I don't think that challenge of life itself and success and career and all those things is going away. So we need to figure out how we're going to cope with that. So we must, I think, that one of the first things that millennials have to do is just accept that life is challenging. It is challenging to put everything together. There's no question. It's so tempting in your 20s to move back in with your parents, because you just face to run your own home and have a relationship with someone and start a family in your 20s. It's very intimidating and sometimes overwhelming, especially if you want total success in your career. That's part of what's at stake here. Here's another category of another map, and it's the ideological confusion of our day. Pluralism may be fun and enriching in some ways at university, but when it comes to finding your own identity in all these different religions and ideologies, it can be really overwhelming and confusing. You can feel really conflicted. Some people have tried the New Age philosophy, and you just pick and choose from these different religions and make up your own religion. But I'm not recommending that. So where are millennials at with religion? I think this is the fundamental statement that they often give: I am spiritual but not religious. So in many ways, they are conflicted and confused about religion. They're skeptical about institutions, but still want purpose and higher meaning. They're open to epiphany, revelation, illumination, improved karma, that sort of thing. But they don't know how to discern between religions. So I'm drawing on some work by sociologist Reginald Bibby in his book, The Millennial MOSAIC. I found that really helpful on this question of religion. It's based on responses of millennials in Canada, and so it's very good research, and I would recommend that book to you if you're wanting to look into this, if you want to dive in more detail. So we see a convergence, he says, of pluralism, individualism, and choice mediated through massive technological advances. So that's kind of the Sitzumleben, the sort of situatedness of the millennial today. You have a cultural mosaic, values mosaic, leisure mosaic, concern mosaic, religion mosaic. It's a kind of nova effect, like, you know, a big explosion of a star with many spiritual paths. This is the actual secular of our today. There's no secular world per se, as Charles Taylor says, a secular atheistic world only. There are many paths that people are following today. Pluralism meets diversity. There's an accelerated diversity occurring due to immigration, education, technology, and globalization. There's a greater diversity is associated with unprecedented choices and the rise of radical individualism and a philosophy of self-interest. And plus, millennials have more access to information than any generation prior to them in history. Now, what we want to say is that this isn't totally bad or negative, that this has positive potential as well. They can leverage their diversity to contribute to the positive collective life and social change. Pluralism offers them a large impetus to understand and accept difference. So they should be good at welcoming the stranger and integrating them into their life, to interact and learn from other cultures, religions, ways of viewing the world. It's the most generous, most highly exposed, and most generous generation, most tolerant generation in history, or yet to date. So mature diversity could actually, Bibby says, it could be a major strength of this generation, but it does require discernment. So how do we navigate the mosaic, discern where we find our own identity amidst the multiple identities of other people? I thought this was a fairly helpful articulation of the process that people are going through these days on this issue. So Bibby says this: moving beyond tolerating each other to talking to each other gets us a high school or junior high certificate. Enjoying each other and learning from each other results in a high school diploma. Incorporating into our lives the best features of our respective cultures and lifestyles, along with the feelings of inclusion, belonging, engagement, and citizenship, gets us a university degree. So he's saying that there is a positive way to navigate the cultural mosaic today. So this is what his book looks like, and I think it's based on significant research. He's been working on youth culture, sociology of youth culture for decades. So these are young scholars joining him, Joel Thiessen and Moneta Bailey, but Reginald is the icon of that, from Lethbridge, University of Lethbridge in Alberta. So how do we help people develop a skill set for discernment, dialogue, and personal growth? We're getting to work towards the solutions for millennial angst, the millennial struggle. So thanks for your patience in walking through these issues. This is a lot to think about at once, but you can go back through the video and take a section at a time and really discuss that in a group or with a friend. So first of all, I think millennials really need to seek out good interlocutors with sound thinking and convictions, people of character. There's a real need for mentorship, and people go to university because they're looking for a good mentor. They're looking for someone to inspire them, to get them excited about a subject area or career area. They need to cultivate the ability to pursue ideas amidst diversity and think for themselves. So that's just learning critical thinking skills and not settling for a sort of tribalistic identity, a small group. Champion continual search for truth versus lies, deception, propaganda, and poor scholarship and spin. So I really believe that a faith that there is truth at the bottom of all this pluralism is really critical. I think that's kept me sane over the years as I've read about different religions, different philosophies, and I've enjoyed that, and I see the conflicting worldviews. I think that, but believing that there is a fundamental truth, a really real world, and that you can come up with answers after wrestling with these things. I think that is a fundamental posture that really helps. Then beware, too much choice can be harmful to one's psychological and social well-being. You don't need to know and grapple with everything, that fear of missing out. I think that some people feel that they have to be cool and know everything, read about everything, every kind of thinker that's available to them all at once. And that would be a problem of confusion. That can create internal confusion for millennials. And then don't buy into the harmful myth of ethical relativism and moral subjectivism. Unfortunately, for far too many Canadians do just that. And this is really not conducive to human joy and flourishing. I've written about that kind of thing on my blog quite a bit. I did a 12-part series on qualities of the will. That's at ubcgcu.org. And in that 12-part series, I've really tried to articulate what is a more positive recovery of the good and moral frameworks. I've used a lot of Charles Taylor in that, so if you want to know more about him, you can appeal to that, that particular blog. Discernment 2.0, a stance. So I think it's important for millennials to remain humble and teachable. Remember that your personal opinion might be poorly examined or ill-informed, weak empirically, bigoted, or seriously biased. I think that's just a good posture, being able to listen to other people, other points of view, and not assuming that you have the final answer on whatever the issue might be. That's what university education is supposed to teach us, but we don't always end up with that kind of posture. Choose the way of meaning, celebrate high values, virtues, ideals like honesty, trustworthiness, compassion, decency, respect for life, good environmental stewardship, taking responsibility for both your own behavior and the well-being of others. That's called an inclusive humanism. Taylor talks about this idea that if you're committed to truth in the area of morality, you should be able to see better, believe better, and live better in the long run. And Jordan Peterson would put it this way: speak the truth and stop lying. He's a little more blunt on this issue. He says we're often, in his 12 rules of life for life, he says we're often lying to ourselves. We're not being honest. And I think that's really critical, that we work on some of these virtues. And David Brooks is really helpful on this topic as well. His book, The Road to Character, and then the second book, The Second Mountain. So this is working on the second mountain, the soulish issues of life. Don't buy into expedients and shortcuts. Shun dishonesty, cheating, abuse, theft, fraud, plagiarism, exploitation, and oppression, things causing emotional pain and suffering to others. The not so good dark side of human nature. So we all have some draw towards the malevolent side of life, the dark side of life, and my caution is to look at that and walk away from it, to walk away from the abyss. Ask yourself what leads to a truly good and noble life. And I think one of the brilliant ideas people have taught me recently is think about your future self. You're in a timeline, you're in a narrative. And the choices you make today, the decisions you make today, the posture you set for yourself today in your 20s will affect you the rest of your life. And so you have to love your future self and start living and designing a life that really can last and can endure. There are these two guys at Stanford University that talk about designing life design. I think they're onto some really good things. They have the most popular class at Stanford University, apparently, because students often don't get training in this area of actually looking at their life in the long run. Choose excellence, learn to distinguish between good, better, and best decisions. Not all theories, worldviews, or moral goods are of equal value. There is a hierarchy of values, and then Charles Taylor really talks about that a lot in Sources of the Self. Think about the consequences of your actions and decisions, including the unintended ones. So these are just a few tips or insights on making it work, so to speak. Sort of going through the jungle of adolescence into adulthood and not going off a cliff or being devoured by a bear, so to speak. So I've written a book called The Great Escape from Nihilism on this project to help people avoid cynicism and move towards a positive outlook. And it's called Rediscovering Our Passion in Late Modernity. So that's the cover of the book. A lot of people are trying to escape boredom and cynicism today, apathy and loss of meaning. And so this book I wrote to understand the kind of prison camp we are in today's world, in late modernity, and how to get out of it and move towards a higher form of life, a thicker self, a better understanding of our future. A little more on religion from BIBBY and the Millennial Mosaic, just to update you on what people are thinking about in Canada. 40% claim to be spiritual but not religious. Organized religion is viewed with caution today. Too many people are leaving the church, unfortunately, and let's win them back and play the long game on this. Digital platforms show good growth potential for outreach among millennials: YouTube, blogs, Instagram. I suppose that's why I'm pushing myself to do more YouTube videos as a result of this, and to talk about some of the tough questions about Christianity. Recently, I found out about a book by McLaughlin called Confronting Christianity, 12 key questions that Christianity needs to answer for today's world. So I'm just starting to read that. I recommend it. It seems to have gotten high reviews as a top book, and for helping people work through some of these issues, some of these spiritual, religious questions. Before you trash your Christian faith, if you're watching this as a Christian, think through some of these tough questions. Don't give up too easily. But 70% of millennials believe in God or a higher power. 50% believe he cares about them. It's a good number. 50% have experienced God's presence in some way. They've had a kind of epiphany. 67% of Canadians in general say they have a spiritual need. 25% say they are strengthened by their faith and experience of God. So, I mean, this is an interesting map of where we are. And it's interesting that the immigrant population, 32% of immigrants attend religious services. So millennials born outside of Canada are actually more inclined to embrace religion. Although 80% identify with a religion, only 30% attend a religious service every month. So that's good. Here it is, the bottom line: 30% embrace religion, 30% reject it, but 40% are in between. So they're thinking about it, you know, pro and con. It's great news that those open to spiritual dialogue include 67 to 70% of the Canadian millennial population. So apologetics is terribly relevant here. Managing doubt and faith, evidence and hard questions, talking rights and justice and peace, and yeah. 33% have no use for religion at all due to the polarization effect of the alt-right and religious triumphalism. And we see that particularly in the United States, but I think it's true in Canada as well. And this idea that you can become quite tribal and just watch the YouTube videos that reinforce your biases and your anger, hatred. You know, you can find that people have as much rage as you do on the internet. Okay, so I think that I guess this video is really all about conversation, about dialogue, about discussion, about investigation, about embracing good ideas, things that will make us stronger, more resilient, healthier, happier, have more joy. So, so I would say that people just need to realize that if it's the millennial is their son or daughter, or if it's their brother or sister, this is about process, and people need time to process. They need to take time for walking with a friend or walking on the beach, just thinking through, going out into the woods maybe, and finding their true self, taking time away from the rat race to discover. Just, excuse me a minute. Okay. So Fyodor Dostoevsky says, true faith bursts forth from the crucible of doubt. I like that quote. So let's now turn to the moral aspect of recovery, or answering the millennial angst. Recovery of virtue, meaning, and identity. Those kind of go together. Morality, meaning, and identity, as Charles Taylor says. So here's the book by David Brooks, The Road to Character. I found if we're looking for inspiration, sometimes we have to look at certain lives, and very much he covers about 10 different lives. But at the end of the book, he also outlines 15 major virtues. And I found this really inspiring, really helpful. He's really captured it here. He's the author of Social Animal as well. David Brooks is a journalist, a very good writer. He gets to the heart of these issues, and I'm really thankful for his contribution in this area. So identity, morality, spirituality, I think these all are interwoven towards a thick, resilient self by recovering the virtues. Charles Taylor, in his book, The Language Animal, shows that our identity is interwoven with our morality and spirituality. We are complex language animals in search of meaning, identity, calling, and community. It's a crucial age for shaping these virtues for spiritual formation and character development. So there are spiritual directors out there, some of them in churches and some of them in various sectors. Such a key window as your 20s and 30s should not be squandered. It's a great time to get on track with the virtues and to start working on the soulish issues, so to speak. Presently, millennials are underserved in the knowledge of the power of virtue, integrity, the importance of character, and agape love by church, university, and society. So we have to kind of sober up from our high-tech stupor and get on with some of these character issues, developing character. One of my beefs with university education is there's not nearly enough emphasis on character and values development. This is the very age when people respond best to virtue mentorship and challenging character interventions, where narcissism, entitlement can turn into servanthood and hospitality. This book by Mark McMinn is very helpful. He's within the field of positive psychology. And there's a really exploding, since 2000, there's an exploding research on the question of virtue. And so Mark has really given us a nice, helpful introduction. He shows why the virtues of generosity, gratitude, forgiveness, and all those things, how they actually work in relationships and in society, and how they make a difference. So I recommend this book. And notice I recommend a few books. That's been my life, to recommend a good book. Can change your life, develop your soul. David Brooks, in his book, The Road to Character, he compares Adam 1 and Adam 2. And I found this a very helpful metaphor. Adam 1 refers to our career success, fame, wealth, personal self-actualization goals. He calls that the first mountain. And for the most part, university education and training today and office mentoring relates to this whole area. You know, you're always going to seminars, more seminars. Listen to this YouTube video, this talk here and there. It's all about developing your career, giving your skill set a go at the world, you know. Adam 2 refers to the deeper things of spiritual formation, like virtue, character, quality of relationships, and personal integrity. This is, and joy. This is his articulation is best stated in the second mountain, his book, The Second Mountain, which I'm reading right now and really enjoying. It's fabulous. It's a fabulous book. I'm really thankful for David Brooks because he's really got this issue out there in the public space. And he's a very articulate advocate of these virtues. Brooks suggests that today's society and university is far too focused on Adam 1, but very weak in promoting the values of mature Adam 2. Adam 2, the person of inner character, is essential to good employment, experience, healthy family relationship, and one's meaningful, responsible stance and contribution, citizenship and civility. And as I read you some of his comments on the question of suffering and just how suffering can really move towards wisdom and personal virtue. So I think far too little is made of virtue and this kind of thing. We've substituted the language of values for virtue in our day, and I think that's due to Max Weber, but unfortunately that's more of a nihilistic form of looking at the world, individualistic. Here's a definition of virtue. A virtue is a state of praiseworthy character formed by choices over time. A virtue disposes us to act in certain excellent ways. Knowing which way is a truly excellent way involves avoiding the extremes of vice by looking to people of virtue as role models. As certain virtues shape our character, they influence how we see the world. The entire process of forming virtues is shaped by a particular narrative and community. The settled disposition to act well is nurtured by the stories we imbibe and the communities of which we are a part. And both of those last statements, the stories we imbibe and the communities of which we are a part, these are essential. And you see some biblical passages that talk about that sort of thing. This quote comes from Stephen Boomerprediger, a key advocate for the environmental movement, from his book, Beauty of the Earth. He talks about the importance of virtues as we look at creation itself. And I think he's a brilliant man from Hope College. So going back to some of the insights from Mark McMinn's book, he quotes Yale psychologist Robert Sternberg, who says that wisdom is a key foundation for virtue. Wisdom is involved when practical intelligence is applied to maximizing not just one's own or someone else's self-interest, but rather a balance of various self-interests, the interpersonal with the interests of others, interpersonal, and of other aspects of the context in which one lives, extra-personal, such as one's city or country or environment, or even God himself, the divine. Wisdom is the foundational virtue. A commitment to growth and insight and character throughout one's whole life journey is a core virtue concept, a posture which entails management of other virtues. This sort of fits with Charles Taylor, his idea of the moral framework, in which he talks about the hypergood and a moral framework with several different goods, but one good, this would be wisdom in this case, would be managing the other goods in your life. So how do you sort out all these inner convictions that you have and get them in a kind of order or hierarchy so that they're not just conflicting with each other? Pursue wisdom is what Mark McMinn is saying. It entails the full picture, the natural and purposeful end of our moral and physical capacities, intentions towards the fully functioning and flourishing human life. It requires a vision of what is possible in a good life. And these two authors, teachers at Stanford University very much say, woe betide the person that does not take some time out to sit down and design some idea of what a good life would look like, rather than just plowing into your first job and or just escaping the world and traveling for 2 or 3 years. Nothing wrong with traveling as long as it's kept in balance. But I think this idea of thinking about what in the future would be a good life. So am I in a good life right now? And what would it mean to move towards a good life? Do I want family? Do I want connection? Do I want community? Do I want to be around people I trust and admire? That's the sort of thing. So I think that that's a really critical aspect of moving forward for millennials. And sometimes they need help with that. They need to consult, not just with their friends, but with experts. So recovery through narrative. Seekers are on a journey growing psychologically, spiritually, and morally from youth to adulthood. There's a sense of gestalt or take on reality. There's a sort of a aha moment sometimes. We go, that's what my life is all about. So if we refuse to look inside ourselves and say, what is important to my life and what is important to my future and the future of others that I will be associated with, I think we're hurting ourselves. So again, Peterson has been good on this with students to help them go back through the history. And if they're stuck, they're in a state of stuckness and they want to drop out of university, that they would go back and do a journey back into their life and see where the issues are, the pain is, reckon with that, and then make some goals for the future. Because I think if you don't deal with the past, it's pretty hard to move forward in the future. Cultural amnesia of the great story is partly due to late modern or postmodern trashing of the meta-narrative in the humanities and social sciences. the so-called incredulity towards meta-narrative you'd hear from Lyotard or people like that. In many sectors, the great biblical stories are tragically dismissed, mocked, and marginalized when they offer so much towards a strong identity development. Dr. Jordan Peterson, the psychoanalyst at University of Toronto, is one academic helping to recover them. The biblical texts, he says, are foundational for Western identity. So I think you wouldn't waste your time understanding the biblical stories better. Great stories, great poetry, great music offer us vital hermeneutical tools to clarify who we are, where we fit in, what is our calling. Notice the reckoning with stories that this hiker from Austria had to go through in the movie 7 Years in Tibet. The character was played by Brad Pitt, where he encounters the Dalai Lama and realizes that he needs to reckon with what he's here on the planet for, not just for his own heroism and winning hiking awards, but caring for his family and that sort of thing. So I remember just recently I was listening to a concert by Bruce Cockburn, a famous Canadian poet, songwriter, and musician, and I've loved his music over the years. And I was just reminded of how important Bruce Cockburn has been to help me walk through my story, to figure out life, to wrestle with different cultural, social justice issues. He's a brilliant man in that way. And so he went through a history of his own music, and that was reminding me of my own story and how I've developed and grown over the years. An exemplary sign of this, how narrative is healing, is Dr. Alistair Martin-Smith, a drama professor at University of Toronto, OISE. He shows that recovery can happen for lost youth through engagement with Shakespeare, one of the all-time great storytellers. So I met him at a conference recently, and in London, New York, and Toronto, he has worked with street youth and got them reading and re-articulating and acting out Shakespeare plays. And for many of them, that brought a healing process. They moved from being marginalized youth, and some of them have gone on to university and studied English literature. He's a Paul Ricoeur fan, and this very much, Paul Ricoeur is strong on the question of the narrative identity. He's a key academic at University of Chicago. So be a good biographer of your own story. You may not think your story fits for television or the movies or that sort of thing. That doesn't matter. Work on your story, write a letter to your future self, and keep building that story over time. So that's why we highly recommend journaling and this sort of thing. And finally, maybe chill out with a good song. This is an old Cat Stevens song where a father is speaking to his son, and I found it terribly appropriate to as a story for millennials today. You will still be here tomorrow, but your dreams may not. I once was like you. I once was like you are now. I was once like you are now, and I know it's not easy. You're still young, that's your fault. There's so much you have to know. Find a girl, settle down. If you want, you can marry. Or it could be find a boy, settle down. If you want, you can marry. Look at me, I'm old, but I'm happy. Yeah, I mean, that speaks to the angst and the journey of millennials today. And Lauren Daigle, Christian artist, has this song, You Say. It's a beautiful statement on that if we look to ourselves, our own success, for our total identity, we're going to have a weak identity. But in this song, Lauren Daigle looks to God and say, God, what you say about me is what's important. And it's great. And then David Crowder's song, Come As You Are. Really appreciate both of those Christian artists. real depth and quality in their work. So here's some of the resources I would recommend. James K. Smith, You Are What You Love. Brian Walsh's Kicking at the Darkness on Bruce Cockburn and the Christian Imagination. Reginald Bibby on his Millennial MOSAIC. We've talked about these other books. I found recently a book very helpful, Frances Jensen and Amy Ellis Nutt, The Teenage Brain, a Neuroscientist Survival Guide to Raising Adolescents and Young Adults. The fact is, part of the problem is that our brains are developing and myelinating during these adolescent years, and that's also part of our angst and struggle. And we're becoming moral beings, basically. Here's a website for research by the BURNOUT Institute on American millennials, and so I recommend that as well. As I say, there's another YouTube video on Charles Taylor, which I've done recently, Charles Taylor and the Modern Quest for Identity, Dialogue and a Great Mind. And I recommend that to you. There's the connection, the link. You can see that here. So I think that's it for now. We've done a bit of a dive into the millennial angst and some of the ways that millennials can find their way in the world today. Ways in which we can help them and guide them and also come alongside them and encourage them. So thanks for listening. It's been great. I appreciate your feedback, and we'll see if we can come up with another video another time to help out further. Thanks.